Hey everybody, I'm Billy Norden. I'm the Retirement and Financial Education Coordinator for the RCA Board of Benefit Services.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Radcliffe. I'm the Director of Future Church Innovation for the RCA.
So this is called Jumpstart, where we're here to help you and your congregation get unstuck, wherever you might be feeling stuck.
Throughout this video series, we'll offer stories, personal stories, and congregational stories of leaders who have gotten stuck and how they've gotten unstuck. We'll offer you research and data about current opportunities and current ways in which people are getting unstuck, and we have some grant opportunities to offer you. This is Jumpstart. So today we're talking about calling, and I thought that it would be interesting to just hear your story. I'll share mine too, but I really want to hear, how did you get into ministry?
Yeah, so I grew up in the church, right? I'm a generational pastor's kid,
Oh, you are?
so I think often when people grow up in the church, they're like, well, it just became familiar, boring, and I had to get away from it. And I think you do in your 20s. You have to differentiate and get out there on your own. So now that I'm older and I look back, it was a fine experience growing up in the church. But in college, I needed to walk away from it. Walked away from it for 4 years, found amazing, real community and friendship. But it was apart from the church, and I missed it. And all of a sudden, I realized both what real community was and how amazing it was, and how that community was disconnected from something I was discovering was really good and missing in my life, which was the church. And so I began to realize that I could potentially be a bridge with this thing that I loved, that the message and the way of Christ in the Bible in this amazing, true, rough around the edges community that I was a part of. And for me, that was there was this strange entry point, and I felt almost guilty, or people would be suspicious of me being in this rough around the edges community, but then going into ministry. But it was one of those things where calling is never 100% clear. It's always this sort of gut leading that you just have to take a chance on. What about you?
Well, sorry, I'm just thinking about the disconnect there. I want to just go into that a little bit. So
Sure.
when you said you left the church, did you leave your faith?
No, I don't think I ever did. Certainly my faith unraveled a little bit as I realized the world is more complex, right, than the Sunday school type of scenario that's put out in front of us, right? So I began to start to leave behind some of the elements of my faith, my given faith that didn't work for me, but also when you start to understand or explore what really matters, then your faith grows deeper.
Yeah, right.
With a few things, right? You're not going to bring everything from the past journey with you, but what you do hold on to is then more tightly and deeply held.
Okay, so I feel like there's something about that. So that kind of then led you. When did you go to seminary?
I went to seminary right after college. I mean, I was
okay.
really feeling like going from junior to senior year, really sort of aimless. And that's where I took a summer. I worked at Cran Hill Ranch.
Yeah,
and just said,
you did.
I need some space.
Is that the camp with horses?
It's the camp with horses.
Nice.
Yep.
Nice.
And I just took the space to actually be quiet and listen. And that's where I started to really feel some clear spiritual discernment, but also some outside sources kind of nudging me in that direction too.
Oh, interesting. So people that you had kind of been walking alongside.
Yeah. Well, and so there's a question coming up, right, where we talk about who has maybe been an important part of our calling.
Yeah.
And there was a moment during that summer that I'll talk about.
Okay,
in a
I
little
want to
bit.
hear that. So yeah, I mean, mine's similar. My story is similar. I grew up in the church, and from a very young age, I can remember there was I think I was 4, 3 or 4, and I remember someone who's in psychology can fact check if you can remember at that age. I don't know. We need a fact checker for this. But I remember praying and just asking God to use me like he used Mary, which feels weird.
Very pious.
Yeah, I think it was just honestly the only female that I could latch onto was Mary. 'Cause, that was the role model I had at that time. And then as I got older, I was in 7th grade, and I had a very kind of charismatic moment where I was in the sanctuary, I was watching the pastor preach, and I heard the voice of the Lord say, this is what you will do. And I was like, no, I will not do that. And so then between junior and senior year, actually, I worked at Camp Geneva, which is here in Michigan. And I had this moment where I was just really disrupted by the way I saw young women particularly during the all camp game, we play capture the flag, and I'm very competitive. And these girls, like, I came into my cabin, and they were in the bathroom. They're all putting makeup on and getting ready. And I just walked in, and I was like, ladies, what are we doing? And they were like, we're getting ready. And I'm like, for the camp game? You need a sock and some tennis shoes. Get out. Get out of the cabin. And they were like, but Aunt Anna, we gotta compete with the boys. I'm like, distracting them with your beauty is not competing. Like, that's not it.
So you wanted to show them a different way of showing up as a woman.
Totally. Well, and also just like, so what happened then is I kicked him out, and I said, if I catch you getting ready in this way again for this game, I'm going to put black construction paper all over this mirror, because this is not the point of being here. And then I walked in my closet, and I just started sobbing, because I was like, something feels wrong about this. This doesn't feel right. So then I went back to school and changed my major, and I like walked into my advisor's office, and I was like, hey, I think I don't need this last class, so I don't need another semester at Hope. And he was like, yeah, you don't need it. You're going to seminary. And I graduated right then. And then I walked over to Western, and I was like, I just graduated. Here's my papers. And they were like, sure, you can take a class. So that's how I started.
Oh, that's amazing. So like that's where like our stories converge a little bit, because I had this moment where I was like, I had to almost like submit to the reality I was going to go to seminary, and so I literally, because we went to same college and seminary, which is a little stereotypical, but we did it, right? Classic. So I walked across campus, and I was just like, listen, I know that the deadline for applying is passed. Will you take me? And,
will you accept me?
Will you bring me in?
Take me as I am.
And they did. And then, that was the beginning of the next chapter. But it's that modeling thing, right? You wanted to show them a different way of being in the world. And I think it's similar for my story, where a lot of the ministers I saw were like the pedestal ministers, right? Like, I am a little bit holy, I'm flowery in my language, and I just wanted to be a minister who,
Billy for the people,
swore a little bit, who had the same mistakes, if not more, and every time people would try to prop me up on the pedestal, I'd say, no.
Take that
no,
off.
Thank you. I will be down here with the rest of y'all. But it's important, and it's not that we're not trying, right, to be our best selves in the world, but it's a both and of saying, like, we're no different than anybody else out there, but we're going to strive to live life to the fullest.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of there's two sort of connections here. One is like there are people that are on the journey with us as we're going through this calling and this vocation. And I'm just curious, like, after you stepped into this role, what did that look like to really fully own that this is who you're going to be, which is a minister, a pastor? Were there people that were walking alongside of you?
I think there's various people that God brings into your life along the journey. I mean, so going back to the Crayon Hill days, right, where I'm trying to discern the call, there was a guest minister who came, and I was kind of captivated by his message one Sunday morning, and so we were chatting afterwards. Come to find out, though, that he was part of the same fraternity that I was a part of in college, which was like stunning to me at the time, because that was the rough around the edges group.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was a moment where I even said to him, like I never really envisioned people like us could be ministers, and he really encouraged me, like in that moment. The craziest part about this story is, as I grew in ministry and got to know who he was, we could not have been more different in the RCA and in the church. Like really, really, really different. like I don't know that I would have even spoken to him if I had known. But there was a moment that God placed us in the same spot that was actually really critical for me going into ministry. So you just never know. Right? A, who's going to speak to you, or who you're going to have an impact on as well. Like, there are just these little moments. And so for me, it really motivates me. Make the most out of every relationship interaction. And if you see a gift in somebody, like, lift them up.
Lift it up.
Yeah, share.
Lift it up. Oh, that's such a good point. It's funny, even when you said that, I was thinking about certain people that I had come alongside of us. My husband interned when we were in seminary at a very small congregation out in kind of a rural part of the city. And that church was one of the most loving and caring churches, even though they were not affirming of women at all. they supported us, and it was kind of the first time I grew up in a setting where it was very affirming of women's gifts. And this church was not, but they still managed to make space for me, even though they were like kind of questioning or disrupted by my presence. And so I would lead Bible studies with them, and the pastor slowly started to give me space on stage. It wasn't behind the pulpit, it wasn't preaching, but it was like, when I would help lead worship, it was like reading scripture or something. And but the reason why we interned there is because the pastors were so relational, and they were so good at catching the story of who we were and sharing their story of who they are in a way that it felt approachable, and it felt affirming, like we were continuing to live life together.
Yeah.
I think that's what, when I think about this leadership modeling and just continuing to raise up leaders, like that is so meaningful. And I don't know how often we feel like that's part of the job.
Yeah. Well, and that just shows that modeling the way of living fully into Christ is a long game.
Yeah.
Right? It is a long game. You were doing that even though they were not ready for it. You were making them uncomfortable just by being who you were in ministry. I've got 2 friends who are co-pastors as well. Their first job was co-pastoring together as a shared associate minister role at a church in Wisconsin. And so she was their first female minister, ordained minister, and it was at a time where they didn't ordain women as elders or deacons. Her whole time there, right? And so there's this cognitive dissonance there, but you have to start somewhere.
Right.
So whether it's being a woman in ministry and showing that women have full gifts for ministry, or whether it's having a conversation about money where people are not ready to have that, right? You start somewhere, you create some discomfort, and you just go for it, and you might not see the fruit of that conversation for 5-10 years.
Right. Yeah, because relationships take time. That's totally a good point. Let's talk a little bit about, like, we know several ministers. There's tons of reports that continue to come out about ministers leaving their professions for something else. The church is in a different state than what it was in the 90s. The way in which we're called to lead is just very different. And I'm curious about, like, if you can share a time when you were kind of facing a challenge or kind of going through this challenge in ministry where it really helped to have someone come alongside of you.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think a lot of ministers in our circle would resonate with what was called Ritter or Churches Learning Change, right? Where there was funding, facilitation, and some really good mentor-type figures. So, Jim Harrington, a Tricia Taylor, they impacted so many ministers in the Reformed Church in America and well beyond that, simply because they gathered us together and they came with a different approach.
Yeah.
So often we're told what to do or how to do it. And this was inviting us to sort of do the painful work of personal growth. And we often get real catty or annoyed with the things that happen to us in church, and you have to vent. You have to vent a little bit. But I think the best mentors encourage you to address what it was like for you, how it felt, and then how to go back to that person or that group and work towards restoration, really. Work towards something better, which is the hardest work to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just think there's, like, we just had a really hard conversation at our church, and what I find the hardest of kind of staying in the conflict is being willing to be the first person to start by saying, hey, we're not well in our relationship. How do we restore this, or how do we repair this? And I think for me, what has been helpful is having colleagues where I can just kind of run my thoughts by it, like, so that I'm playing out the scenario and have kind of how I want the conversation to go. That's been really helpful.
Who are the people that have challenged you?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. So my spouse is my co-pastor, and we have really created, I think, a relationship where if I just am unable to listen, that's really what happens when I'm, like, so focused or so unwilling to be challenged, I just stop listening. He's the one that can really lean in and say, hey, you're not listening. And then I have a very good friend who's also a therapist, which is convenient. She tells me she's not being a therapist for me, but
Do
she
you
just
get a
has
bill
the skills.
after?
I don't get a bill. I don't get a bill. But she has the skills to be able to say, "Hey, that's not correct. What you're thinking is just not correct. You're perceiving this wrong." Or and so I just feel like having those relationships, even though she's not clergy, she can understand the dynamics in a way. And then the last one is I have a coach. And she's just really faithful and fearless to just, she often will challenge me because I think in black and white, and she'll often be like, I just want to encourage you to see this as maybe more than just a black and white scenario. So what about you? Who do you have?
Well, I think that's really important, right? To list like coaches, therapists, colleagues. Sometimes friends will do it, but friends, we're careful around each other too.
I know, yeah.
And we're not always willing to offer the sort of hard challenge that somebody that knows that's their role.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, and so similar, right? For the longest time, I co-pastored with my wife, and so, boy.
Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, there's nothing like a spouse who can kind of call you out, right?
It's helpful.
Or call you out in a healthy and a good way to challenge you.
Yeah.
Similarly, I had a coach for a number of years in ministry, and I remember I was going through a really hard relational situation with an older gentleman, and I was just like, this has been a decades-long issue. There's no repairing, no going back. And he was like, well, have you talked to him about it? And I was like, well, no, it's not going to work. And, are you going to talk to him about it? Right? Just kept pushing and persisting because he knew, and it's obvious to anyone on the outside, that's the only way forward. But I was so wounded and so resistant to it that I needed that other presence in my life to just push me pretty hard.
Yeah. Okay, so this is interesting because I think that this is happening a lot, right? Where pastors are in these critical moments. It's hard out there to minister in the climate of the United States, in the world, just the way that things have shifted since COVID. It's been a hard space to minister. And so I think one of the big things that we were talking about is that many pastors are no longer willing to stay in the church. They're actually finding their vocations elsewhere. And so it's been making me think about this idea of this connection with calling and how do we continue to live into the calling? Mm-hmm. How do we stay in it? We were just talking about pastors who are leaving ministry to go pursue being therapists.
Yeah.
Can you remind me what you said about that? You were like, it makes sense because they want to heal.
Right. They want to heal people, right? So much of ministry, so much of pastoring is that spiritual nurturing of folks, like helping the wounds become healed.
Right.
Right. And so therapy, counseling, that's an area where you can still get paid to do that work with people. So it's so attractive to ministers as church jobs are drying up in some ways, right? It's a supply and demand issue right now, and many churches are less financially sustainable than they used to be.
Yeah.
I also think there's something about authenticity right now with ministers where they can only stay in ministry if they feel like they can be authentically them, wrestle with the hard stuff, right? And that's hard in a politically divided country, right?
Totally.
I also think there's been a shift, right? If you look at ministers a few decades ago, I think there was so much more of an emphasis put on showmanship, right? And I'm using the male terminology because it was guys, right? For the most part. There was this showmanship, like put on a good show on Sunday morning. And so to do that, you definitely don't want to let too much of your own beliefs be known in politically divisive or any other divisive subjects. Now ministers are like, I can't live like that.
Yeah.
It's more important for me to share, wrestle, put the hard things out there, but that makes it harder.
Yeah.
Because then people might leave.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's a really interesting point. The authenticity, I'd been processing that a little bit with a coach, and because part of my struggle with just being in a ministry setting, I didn't grow up with ministry parents. They were all in kind of the working sector. Not the working sector, the business sector.
Well, I mean, beyond Sunday mornings, right? They worked beyond Sunday
Ministers
mornings.
Ministers are workers. Anyway, so I didn't know what I was really getting into in a lot of ways. My husband grew up in a very ministry setting, so he did know. And I have just struggled. I'm an Enneagram 8, and so being authentic, being perceived correctly, being understood is a high value for me. And when we were processing it, we started talking about this idea of measured authenticity. It took me a long time to just really get used to this idea. But this idea is really just recognizing that there's spheres in which you get to be your most authentic self. And what it does is it allows you to be in control, which buzzword if you're an Enneagram, it allows you to be in control of where you're authentic and how you choose to be authentic. And that felt more empowering for me. That felt like a tool that I could use to stay connected to my calling and also to continue to feel like I was able to be myself in a job, because that's the hard part about ministry is it's often, because it's a calling, it feels like it's all encompassing of who you are. And when you have this authentic understanding of circles, you start to realize like, oh, because this is my job, I don't have to be my most authentic self in this space.
The circles language is so helpful.
I thought so too.
I think about my colleagues who like sort of burned out or were kicked out of ministry the earliest, and they sort of like took that inner circle of authenticity and just like vomited it out right away.
It's so painful.
And it doesn't work that way, right? So having levels where nothing is necessarily inauthentic, but there are levels of letting people in.
Right. Yeah. It's so, I just think it's hard to understand really yourself and how that bumps into the calling. Because, like, let's be real. I mean, you and I both went to seminary out of college. We were children. Like, we were young. I'm still young, I feel. And
say, he's so wise. Someone who speaks to this 24-year-old.
For someone that young. I think that's probably one of the harder parts. Like, for some of my favorite mentors, Don Poost is one of them. I'm just going to give him a shout out. 40 years in one congregation. Like, that's a long time to stay invested in something that loves you and hates you all the time. And so I think that there's something to that ability to be authentic. The other thing that I just wanted us to think about is this idea of modeling and how our jobs, as we get older, our job starts to shift. Ooh. And if we don't catch that, we start to lose a deeper sense of that calling.
How would you articulate the shift? I'm really curious about this.
Yeah, so I think as we should always have this mentality of that is discipleship, right? It's multiplication of bringing people along with you, raising them up into the way of Jesus so that it's authentic for them, not for you. You know, they're not taking on your authenticity, they're taking on their own authenticity. But then they're going out, right, and continuing to make more disciples. The same is true as we develop leaders, and that's the shift in the job of pastors especially. We're in a state of crisis. Just honestly, ministers are retiring at a rate that we cannot replace them. And so the shift needs to be, as we're starting to see this kind of future of retirement, though RCA people do not retire as quickly, we need to start thinking about who we're investing in and how we are modeling leadership so that they can see it. And start to really, it's that balance between what we talked about earlier, calling out and leaning in and saying, I see these gifts in you, and also really coming alongside of them so that they can flourish and thrive and stay in ministry with longevity.
That's really important. And I mean, I'm just going to steer this really practical right now. I talked about some of my work and some of the grants that we do. Is we do so much education on financial readiness for retirement, which ministers avoid at all costs because they're like, no, I'm all in this. It's not about the money. But then they get towards those pre-retirement years, right? And it becomes a little bit of a crisis. I have to keep working. I have to do a little self-preservation so that I can like survive in retirement. And what happens when you start doing that inward focused crisis thing? You lose the vision for all of the people that you could lift up, get ready, mentor, and
you coast.
Send.
Yeah, you coast.
Right. You coast. You miss those opportunities. So by caring for yourself in the long term throughout the journey, it sets you up better for that shift. To be able to start to look more and more outside of yourself and what God has called you to do for the church directly, and now you're bringing along others and supporting them and sending them.
Yeah, and I see that. We have had so many, as we worked with Next Generation Engagement and Growing Young, which is a resource from the Floor Youth Institute, this idea of keychain leadership is what they talk about. And it's this idea that when you're teaching someone to drive, you don't just hand them the keys and say, good luck, take my car. You sit in the passenger seat with them.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're doing that, you're kind of instructing them in the way of the road. You're helping them understand, like, okay, left turn is hard. You're turning with oncoming traffic. And I think the same is true with ministry. Like, it matters to have those people in your life walking alongside of you, really, again, just kind of nudging you in the right direction so that you stay connected to your calling and identity, but also so that you lead ministry really well. And no one is going to, especially when you're getting towards that retirement, no one is going to say to you, hey, your job's changed. You now should be raising up new leaders. That is an intrinsic motivation that you need to kind of foster for yourself. And if you're in what you're talking about, that retirement crisis, there's no way you're going to be able to just kind of find that. Yeah. So hopefully this is your nudge, if you're watching this.
Right. And that's why we do all those little incentives, right? Just to match some funds, to help do the retirement kickstarts. Yeah. Again, it's just those little habit-building things so that you're ready to be your best self, to be the best minister that you can be in that season of life. And I want to hang on that, like, driving analogy for a second too. I think that's so good.
It's a good one, right?
Because I started with one of my kids, letting them learn how to drive in a parking lot.
Yeah.
Right, really recently. And oh my goodness,
it's
like
terrifying.
Even going crazy slow, but sitting in the passenger seat without the control, it's not perfect.
No.
And it's a little harrowing. And that's what it's like to mentor and to like hand the reins over to somebody else in ministry too. Like, if you expect it's going to be perfect, you're overcorrecting. No, it's not helpful, right? But doing that scary thing of sitting with someone and letting them start to drive.
Yeah.
It's important.
And there's something intentional too. I think I was just reading about single loop, double loop, which is a kind of, it's an organization model developed by this guy, Chris, from the Harvard Business Review. He released this article in 1977 and then kind of re-upped it in 1991. And what he talks about is there's kind of this way in which we do production where it's like you do everything once and you kind of have some systems at the very end where you're evaluating, how did that go? And if it went great, great. If you need to make tweaks, you make tweaks. That's the single loop. The double loop is starting to evaluate how the process was developed from the very beginning. What are the structures and systems that influence that process, and how do those need to be transformed? The same is true in ministry. Mm-hmm. Like, we can go through a week, every week, and just plan the service, make our calls, evaluate how did this week go? Did I get any feedback on Monday morning that my sermon was bad or that the music was horrible? Or, that's that single loop. But the double loop starts to be, what are the systems that are influencing me? Why am I making those worship decisions? Oh, it's because this group of people, they'll get mad at me if I don't do that. Mm-hmm. Oh, why am I visiting these people and forgetting to visit these people? Oh, it's because they'll get mad at me. So when we do that single loop, double loop, we start to really evaluate how are we running our ministries in a way that's really respondent to the people that are in front of us. But then the additional loop, the third loop, is then starting to say, what do we need to do to make sure that this is transformed for the future? Yeah. And that's when you start to bring in that young leader, and that's when you start to infuse them into every loop, the first loop and the second loop, so that they can start to transform it, and you're, as the leader, not necessarily continuing to say, no, we do things the way that we've always done it. We put the cookie table here. Instead, and that's actually a real scenario, my husband moved the cookie table during his internship and people were upset, but then they realized that it worked. And so the pastors just said, when he moved the cookie table, they said to the group, they said, hey, let's just see how it goes. Let's just see what happens. And that ability or that willingness as the senior leader to extend your credibility to the younger leader and say, let's see how it goes. Let's just get curious about what's changing. That is catalytic for ministry because it really does allow everyone to share their gifts. It shakes us up in a way that's really positive and invites us to, again, lean into that authenticity. Who are we? How are we responding to who God is calling us to be right now in this moment? How do we embrace all generations of leaders?
And the thing we're going to keep coming back to, right, is that your system is perfectly designed to give you the results that you're getting.
Exactly.
Right? It's perfectly designed. And so the only way to change is to disrupt that system. And so what you're saying is you've noticed that younger leaders are pretty consistent factors in changing the system by introducing new elements.
And they don't even have to be young. So I do want us to, we'll lean into a story here in a minute, but through the renovations grant, we were kind of stuck. We were just out of COVID. We had a really hard time engaging senior leaders because they were still trying to literally like hold their congregations down to make sure that their anxiety didn't just spew into their communities. And we started to say, who could we invest in that would really benefit from this sort of congregational learning and change? And we started prioritizing children's ministry leaders, youth ministry leaders, church planters, and still senior leaders. And we had one particular children's minister. She was new to her congregation. She walked in and she said, I'd love to do this process. So we walked her through the process, and she, at the end of it, they come up with this idea, this kind of thing to try. So during COVID, there was all these people walking around outside, and she started noticing that there was these young parents, and during the week, there's nothing for them in that area. So she started to think through, looking at the front of their church, what could we do to transform this lobby area? It was like the old dusty narthex where there's like, they don't use the mailboxes anymore. There was a missions table that hadn't been used.
Yeah, missionaries that had been like deceased for 10 years.
Totally.
Yeah.
And like it was supposed to be like the evangelism table too. So there was the mission table and the evangelism table, totally not used. And she said, what if we do a renovation in this space and make a play cafe so that we're able to welcome families in during the week? This can be a safe place for them to come hang out. There'll be coffee in the urns. We'll prepare it. I'm here anyways. And then during the Sunday, it's a great spot for parents and families to come hang out and let your kids play while you're talking and actually have community. And that was kind of the piece that was missing, is their mission and vision from their leadership was, we want to start investing in the next generation of kids. But they had no way of doing that. And so she really aligned those two things. And what it did is it unlocked tons of conversations in the church. The evangelism team started to say, why do we have this dusty front table in the front seat, or in the front of the church? We've not used it. And then also the missions team, same thing. They were like, we got to start talking about the mission and the ministries that we want to do. How do we want to do that? So, there's all different ways. You don't necessarily just have to have a young leader. If you don't have young people in your church, the question is really, who have I not listened to that I should be listening to?
It's creating the freedom, right?
Totally.
Because sometimes there could be a seasoned older leader that's always wanted to do something,
Right.
but they're scared to death, right?
Right.
Of doing it because of any blowback. And so, that's a great example of when it works, or right when you start to see that life. But I think there's also moments where we experiment and it doesn't work. And
Totally.
Did you watch the show The Office?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So do you remember when Michael's out for the day, so Jim has to be the boss, and he decides to streamline the birthday celebration process.
Yes.
And so instead of giving everybody their own birthdays, let's just take all the birthdays this month and do one celebration.
Yeah.
And everybody hates it, and they're so mad, and it's a disaster. And at the end of the episode, Jim and Michael are sitting next to each other, and there's just this knowing all of a sudden between them, where all of a sudden Jim has a little bit more respect for Michael's ridiculous birthday celebrations, because he realized Michael knew how relationally important it was for all of those people. And so even in the moments where we try something and it's a hot mess, it's a disaster, there is good learning, and often relationships can be built if there's that open, experimental, let's try this and see what works.
Right.
And if it doesn't, hey, we're in it together. It's okay.
Right, yeah. This is a great conversation. If you are interested, we're still running the renovations grant. That's an opportunity for you. We'd love to have you. Love to have you join us and kind of hear or engage in a way that the story that I shared might be a reality for you. Thanks for hanging out, Billy.
Yeah, this is great.
We jump started.
Cheers,
Woo!
jump start.